My name is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, and I've spent the last 8 years of my life doing what most people only see in movies. I've defused bombs in Syria, led rescue operations in flood zones across Louisiana, and earned 3 commendations for valor that sit in a drawer somewhere in my studio apartment. But none of that training prepared me for the ivory envelope that slipped through my mail slot on a Tuesday morning in March. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The return address was embossed in gold lettering. The Henderson Estate, Napa Valley. My hands trembled as I recognized the handwriting on the front. Not his handwriting, but hers. Diana Henderson, the woman who would have been my mother-in-law if things had gone differently 3 years ago. The woman who once told me at Christmas dinner that military girls never really settle down properly, that we're too damaged for real relationships. Inside was an invitation to Marcus Henderson's wedding. Marcus, my ex-fiancé of 4 years who'd broken off our engagement 2 weeks before my deployment to Damascus because he couldn't handle the uncertainty, couldn't handle dating someone whose job might get her killed. The same Marcus who'd promised he'd wait, who'd sworn our love was stronger than distance or danger. He was marrying someone named Victoria Ashworth, and apparently I was invited to witness it. I should have torn it up immediately, should have thrown it in the fireplace and pretended it never arrived. But something stopped me. A handwritten note fell from between the invitation cards, written in elegant script I didn't recognize. Sarah, there are things you need to know. Things about why it really ended. Come if you're brave enough to hear the truth. A friend. No signature, no clue who'd written it. Just those words that made my chest tighten with a mixture of dread and curiosity I couldn't shake. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days, mocking me every time I walked past. I'd pick it up, read it again, then set it down like it might explode if I held it too long. Marcus Henderson marrying Victoria Ashworth at the family estate. The same estate where I'd spent countless weekends during our relationship, where his mother had made it clear I'd never quite fit into their world of wine tastings and charity galas. Where his father, Robert Henderson, had barely acknowledged my existence, except to ask uncomfortable questions about my army thing during family dinners. I remember the last conversation I'd had with Marcus before everything fell apart. We were sitting in his car outside the base, and he'd been unusually quiet. I thought he was just nervous about the deployment, about us being apart for 8 months. When he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than any shrapnel ever had. Sarah, I can't do this anymore. I can't sit here wondering if every phone call is going to be someone telling me you're dead. I need someone stable, someone normal. Normal. The word had echoed in my head for months afterward. What made it worse was learning through mutual friends that he'd been seeing Victoria Ashworth for weeks before he broke up with me. Victoria, the daughter of his family's business partners, the kind of woman who wore pearls to brunch and had never worked a day in her life. Everything I wasn't. Everything his family had wanted him to choose instead of me. I'd always suspected his mother had something to do with our breakup, but I'd never had proof. Just the sick feeling in my stomach every time Diana Henderson had looked at me like I was a temporary inconvenience her son would eventually outgrow. The decision to attend came on Friday night while I was cleaning my service weapon at my kitchen table. It was routine maintenance, something that helped me think clearly when my mind was spinning. As I worked, I thought about that anonymous note. Someone wanted me at that wedding, and they wanted me to know the truth about something. After 3 years of wondering if I'd been too demanding, too difficult, too dangerous to love, maybe it was time to face whatever that truth was. I chose my outfit carefully the morning of the wedding. Not my dress blues, not anything that screamed military. I selected a simple black dress, elegant but understated, paired with low heels and minimal jewelry. I wanted to blend in, to observe without causing a scene. I wasn't going there to disrupt their happiness or make demands. I was going for closure, and maybe for answers to questions that had kept me awake too many nights. The drive to Napa took 2 hours, winding through hills covered in perfectly manicured vineyards. The Henderson estate sprawled across a hillside like something from a magazine, all stone terraces and glass walls designed to showcase the valley views. Luxury cars lined the circular drive, and waiters in white jackets carried champagne flutes on silver trays. I felt underdressed despite my careful planning, and suddenly understood why Marcus's family had never thought I belonged in their world. I parked near the back of the lot and sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the guests arrive. Women in designer dresses and men in custom suits, all moving with the casual confidence that comes from never having to worry about money or status. These were people who'd never questioned whether they deserved to be anywhere, who'd never had to prove their worth through actions because their worth was inherited along with their trust funds. The ceremony was being held in the estate's garden, rows of white chairs arranged on a stone terrace overlooking the vineyard. I found a seat near the back, next to an elderly couple who smiled politely but didn't attempt conversation. The setting was breathtaking, everything Marcus had ever dreamed of for his wedding day. I remembered him describing something exactly like this during late-night conversations when we'd planned our future together, back when I'd foolishly believed I was part of that future. Marcus looked handsome standing at the altar in his tailored tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his smile radiant as he waited for his bride. Beside him stood his groomsmen, all fraternity brothers from Stanford, who'd inherited their positions at their father's companies. Robert Henderson, Marcus's father, sat in the front row wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Diana Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the emotional mother of the groom to perfection. When Victoria appeared at the end of the aisle, I had to admit she was stunning. Her dress was custom couture, her blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo adorned with pearls that probably belonged to her grandmother. She glided down the aisle like she'd been born for this moment, like she'd never doubted she deserved to be the center of everyone's attention. The congregation rose as she passed, their faces glowing with approval and admiration. This was the kind of wedding these people understood, the kind of match that made sense in their world. I remained seated as the ceremony began, partly because I was in the back, and partly because standing felt like participating in something that still caused me pain. The officiant spoke about love and commitment, about two souls becoming one, and I tried not to think about the promises Marcus had made to me in quieter moments, about the ring I'd worn for 6 months before giving it back, about the apartment we'd looked at together, about the children we'd planned to have someday when my service was complete. During the vows, Marcus spoke about finding someone who understood him completely, someone who shared his values and his vision for the future. Victoria responded with words about partnership and building a life together, about supporting each other's dreams and aspirations. Pretty words that meant nothing to me, because I knew they were empty. I'd supported Marcus's dreams for 4 years, had rearranged my leave schedule to attend his company events, had learned to navigate his world even when it made me uncomfortable. But apparently that support hadn't been the right kind. The reception moved to a pavilion decorated with white flowers and crystal chandeliers, where a jazz quartet played softly in the corner. I found my assigned seat at table 8, far from the wedding party but not quite banished to the kitchen entrance. The place card read Sarah Mitchell in the same elegant script as the invitation, and I wondered again who had ensured I was included in this celebration. Around me sat strangers who made polite conversation about wine harvests and vacation homes in Europe, topics I couldn't contribute to meaningfully. Dinner was served on china so delicate I was afraid to cut my food too aggressively, accompanied by wines that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. The conversation flowed around me like I was invisible, which suited me fine. I was there to observe, to listen, to understand what I'd been missing in my relationship with Marcus and his family. What I learned was that I'd never really been missing anything at all. These people were polite but hollow, concerned with appearances and status rather than substance or character. The speeches began after dessert, starting with Marcus's college roommate, who told amusing stories about their fraternity days and bachelor party adventures. Then Victoria's maid of honor spoke about their friendship since childhood, about how they'd always dreamed of having weddings like this one. Each speech reinforced the same message. This was how things were supposed to be. This was the natural order of their social circle. This was the kind of love story that made sense to everyone present. When Diana Henderson took the microphone, I felt my chest tighten with anticipation. She'd never missed an opportunity to make subtle digs at me during family gatherings, always wrapped in enough politeness that I couldn't call her out directly. Her speech was a masterpiece of passive aggression disguised as maternal love. She spoke about Marcus's journey to find the right partner, about how important it was for him to choose someone who truly understood his world and his needs. She mentioned the heartbreak of watching him struggle with relationships that weren't quite right, relationships with people who couldn't give him the stability and support he deserved. Her eyes found mine across the pavilion as she spoke about the relief of seeing him finally settled with someone appropriate, someone who would make him happy in the long term, rather than causing him stress and uncertainty. The message was clear to anyone who knew our history. I was the uncertainty she was referring to, the inappropriate choice he'd finally moved past. The other guests nodded approvingly, completely unaware of the personal attack being delivered with such eloquent cruelty. I sat quietly, my face neutral, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about that night, about my relationship with Marcus, and about the family I'd tried so hard to impress. Robert Henderson, who had barely spoken to me during 4 years of family gatherings, stood up from his seat at the head table and walked deliberately toward the microphone his wife had just vacated. The room fell silent as he adjusted the stand and looked out over the assembled guests with an expression I couldn't quite read. This wasn't part of the planned program, and I could see Diana's confusion from across the room as her husband prepared to speak without warning. Robert Henderson cleared his throat and surveyed the room with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms and country clubs. The jazz quartet had stopped playing, and even the waiters had paused their service to listen. Marcus looked puzzled from his seat at the head table, while Victoria's smile had frozen in place like a photograph. Diana Henderson's face had gone pale, and she was making subtle gestures trying to get her husband's attention, but he ignored her completely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice carrying easily across the pavilion without the microphone's amplification. "My wife has spoken beautifully about our son's journey to find happiness, and I won't repeat her sentiments. Instead, I want to share something that I should have said years ago, something that has weighed on my conscience every day since." He paused, letting his words settle over the increasingly uncomfortable audience. The only sounds were the distant hum of cicadas and the soft clinking of glasses as nervous guests set down their wine. 4 years ago, our family met a remarkable young woman. She was strong, principled, and deeply committed to serving something greater than herself. She loved our son with a devotion that was both fierce and selfless, and she treated our family with respect, even when that respect wasn't always reciprocated. My heart began to race as I realized he was talking about me. Around the room, heads were turning slightly, guests trying to figure out what this unexpected speech was building toward. Robert's eyes found mine across the pavilion, and for the first time in all the years I'd known him, I saw something that looked like regret. That young woman wore a uniform instead of designer dresses. She spoke about duty and sacrifice instead of charity galas and wine pairings. She was preparing to risk her life for strangers in a foreign country, while most of us worried about our stock portfolios and vacation plans. And instead of celebrating her courage, instead of welcoming her into our family with open arms, we did something I'm deeply ashamed of. Diana Henderson was now frantically shaking her head, her composure cracking as she realized where her husband's speech was heading. Marcus had gone completely still, his face a mask of confusion and growing dread. The guests were no longer trying to hide their curiosity, all pretense of polite disinterest abandoned as they sensed drama unfolding before them. "We convinced our son that he deserved someone more suitable to our lifestyle," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We planted seeds of doubt about whether military relationships could work long-term. We emphasized the challenges and the risks while ignoring the extraordinary character of the woman he'd chosen to love. We made him question whether he was strong enough for the uncertainty, whether he was selfish for wanting stability." The admission hung in the air like an accusation, and I felt tears threatening for the first time that evening. "What we didn't tell him," Robert said, turning now to look directly at Marcus, "was that 3 weeks before you broke up with Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, she had requested a transfer to a stateside position. She had put in for a training instructor role at Fort Benning that would have kept her in Georgia permanently. She was willing to give up the career path she'd dreamed of since childhood, willing to step away from active combat operations, because she loved you and wanted to build a life together." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd submitted that transfer request in secret, planning to surprise Marcus when it was approved. I'd never told him, because I wanted to be certain it would go through before getting his hopes up. The paperwork had been sitting on my commander's desk the day Marcus ended our engagement, and I'd withdrawn it the next morning in a haze of heartbreak and wounded pride. Marcus's face had gone white, and he was staring at his father with an expression of dawning horror. Victoria looked between her new husband and Robert with growing alarm, clearly beginning to understand that this speech was destroying her perfect wedding day. But Robert wasn't finished, and the momentum of confession seemed to be carrying him forward past any possibility of retreat. "The transfer never went through because after you broke up with her, Sarah withdrew her request," Robert continued mercilessly. "She spent the next 8 months in one of the most dangerous regions of Syria, leading a bomb disposal unit through some of the heaviest fighting of the entire conflict. While we were planning your engagement party to Victoria, Lieutenant Mitchell was defusing improvised explosive devices that could have killed her and her entire team on any given day." I closed my eyes, remembering those months in Damascus with crystal clarity. The sand that got into everything, the weight of the bomb suit in 100-degree heat, the constant tension of knowing that one wrong move could end not just my life but the lives of the soldiers depending on me. I'd thrown myself into the work with desperate intensity, using the adrenaline and focus required for explosive ordnance disposal to numb the pain of losing everything I'd thought my future would hold. "But that's not why I'm telling you all this," Robert said, and his voice had changed again, taking on a tone of deep respect that I'd never heard him use before. "I'm telling you this because 2 months ago, I learned something that has kept me awake every night since. During her deployment in Syria, Lieutenant Mitchell's unit was ambushed while responding to reports of civilians trapped in a collapsed building. Her team was pinned down by sniper fire for 6 hours, and when their radio equipment was damaged, she volunteered to cross open ground under enemy fire to reach higher ground and call for extraction. The pavilion had gone completely silent now. Even the staff had stopped moving, standing frozen in place as Robert's words painted a picture of courage that most of these privileged guests couldn't begin to comprehend. I felt exposed and vulnerable having my service record discussed so publicly, but there was something in Robert's voice that kept me from standing up and leaving. She made it to the radio, called in their position, and then realized that the building collapse had trapped a family of refugees, including 2 small children. Instead of staying in her secure position until extraction arrived, she went back into the danger zone. She spent 4 hours digging through rubble with her bare hands while bullets flew overhead, and she pulled 3 people out alive. Robert's voice broke slightly on the last words, and I saw him take a steadying breath before continuing. One of those people was an 8-year-old girl named Amara, who had been buried under concrete for nearly 12 hours. Sarah performed CPR on that child for 20 minutes, breathing life back into her when everyone else assumed she was dead. That little girl is alive today, living with relatives in Jordan, because a woman we dismissed as unsuitable for our family refused to leave anyone behind. I was crying now, though I tried to hide it by looking down at my hands. I hadn't talked about Amara with anyone, not even my commanding officers, beyond the official debrief. The weight of that day, the feel of small ribs under my hands as I pushed air into tiny lungs, the moment when she'd coughed and opened her eyes, had been too sacred and too painful to share. Knowing that somehow Robert had learned about it, had cared enough to find out what had happened to me after I left his son's life, was overwhelming in ways I couldn't process. "The reason I know these details," Robert continued, and now his voice carried a weight of authority that commanded absolute attention, "is because the Army contacted me 6 weeks ago. They're preparing to award Lieutenant Mitchell the Bronze Star with Valor for her actions that day, and they wanted to include family members in the ceremony. When they called our house looking for Marcus as her emergency contact, my wife told them they had the wrong number." A collective gasp rose from the assembled guests, and Diana Henderson looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. Marcus was staring at his mother with an expression of betrayal and disbelief, while Victoria had gone completely rigid beside him. The revelation that the Army had tried to reach out, that my service was being honored at the highest levels, and that Diana had deliberately blocked that contact was devastating in its implications. "I called them back," Robert said quietly. "I explained the situation and asked if there was anything our family could do to support the ceremony. The officer I spoke with told me something that I will remember for the rest of my life. He said that Lieutenant Mitchell had never listed any family members or personal contacts for notification in case of injury or death. Her emergency contact was her commanding officer, and her personal effects were to be donated to military charities. She had made herself completely alone in the world. Rather than risk putting people through the worry and uncertainty we had convinced her she had no right to ask for." The silence in the pavilion was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Robert had laid bare not just my service record but the emotional devastation that had led me to isolate myself from any possibility of personal connection. The guests were staring at me now with expressions ranging from amazement to shame, finally understanding the caliber of person who had been sitting quietly among them all evening. Robert stepped away from the microphone and began walking across the pavilion toward my table. His movement broke the spell that had held everyone frozen, and I could hear whispers starting up again as people began to process what they'd just heard. Marcus was still staring at his father in shock, while Diana was frantically whispering something to the woman beside her, probably trying to do damage control. When Robert reached my table, he stopped directly in front of my chair and looked down at me with an expression I'd never seen before. There was respect there, and regret, but also something that looked almost like pride. Without saying a word, he straightened his shoulders, lifted his right hand to his forehead, and gave me a perfect military salute. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything I knew about Robert Henderson, that I nearly fell out of my chair. Around us, the pavilion erupted in scattered applause and murmured conversations as guests tried to understand what they were witnessing. But for me, in that moment, there was only the sight of a man who had never respected my choices, acknowledging not just my service but my sacrifice. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. Then, without thinking, I returned his salute with the precision and dignity that had been drilled into me since basic training. It was a moment of mutual recognition that transcended all the hurt and disappointment of the past. Acknowledgement that some things matter more than social status or family expectations. When we lowered our hands, Robert spoke quietly. His words meant only for me. "I owe you an apology that I can never adequately give, and my son owes you a truth that he's only beginning to understand. But mostly, I owe you a thank you for your service that I should have given years ago." He paused, then added with quiet intensity, "You were never unsuitable for our family, Lieutenant. Our family was unsuitable for you." The applause that followed our exchange felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Robert Henderson returned to his seat with the same measured dignity he'd shown throughout his speech, leaving me standing beside my chair as the focus of several hundred pairs of eyes. I had never wanted this kind of attention, had never sought vindication in such a public forum, but there was something deeply healing about having my service acknowledged by the man whose opinion had shaped so much of my heartbreak. Marcus was the first to move. He stood abruptly from the head table, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor, and began walking toward me with quick, determined steps. Victoria reached for his arm, trying to stop him, but he shook off her grasp without looking back. His face was a mixture of anguish and something that looked like dawning realization, and I found myself taking an involuntary step backward as he approached. "Sarah," he said when he reached me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it true? About the transfer request?" The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure either of us was ready to cross. Around us, guests were pretending to resume their conversations while obviously straining to hear our exchange, but I found I didn't care about their curiosity anymore. I looked into the eyes of the man I'd once planned to marry, searching for some sign of the person I'd fallen in love with years ago. What I saw there was genuine pain and confusion, but also a weakness I'd never allowed myself to acknowledge during our relationship. Marcus had always been someone who chose the path of least resistance, who let others make the difficult decisions and then followed their lead. Standing there in his wedding tuxedo, he looked exactly like what he'd always been, a man who had never learned to fight for what he claimed to want. "Yes," I said simply. "It's true. I could have said more, could have explained the sleepless nights I'd spent researching stateside positions, the careful negotiations with my commanding officer, the hope that had sustained me through those final weeks of our relationship. But Marcus had made his choice 3 years ago, and no amount of explanation would change the consequences of that decision. He closed his eyes as if my confirmation had physically wounded him. Why didn't you tell me? If I'd known you were willing to give up deployment, willing to stay stateside, everything would have been different. His voice carried a note of desperate pleading that made me feel sorry for him rather than angry. Would it have been different? I asked gently. Or would your family have found other reasons why I wasn't suitable? Other ways to convince you that loving me was too complicated, too risky for their golden son? The questions weren't accusations, just honest curiosity about roads not taken and choices that couldn't be undone. Before Marcus could answer, Diana Henderson appeared beside us like a force of nature barely contained in an elegant evening gown. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the panic in her eyes, and her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Sarah, dear, I think there's been some misunderstanding about the Army's call. I simply thought it was some sort of solicitation. Military charities call so often, and I didn't want to bother Marcus during such a busy time with wedding preparations. The lie was so transparent that even she seemed to realize how hollow it sounded. I studied her face, seeing clearly for the first time the calculating intelligence that had orchestrated my removal from her son's life with surgical precision. Diana Henderson wasn't evil, just ruthlessly protective of a world where her family's comfort and status mattered more than individual happiness or moral courage. Mrs. Henderson, I said calmly, we both know that's not true. But I'm not here to relitigate the past or demand apologies from anyone. Your husband's words tonight were more acknowledgement than I ever expected to receive, and I'm grateful for his honesty. I could see her relief at my measured response, but I wasn't finished. What I am curious about is who sent me the invitation, and who wrote the note that brought me here tonight. Diana's face went completely white, and she glanced quickly toward her husband before looking back at me with something that might have been fear. I don't know anything about a note, she said too quickly, her voice rising slightly in pitch. The invitation list was handled by Victoria's family. I had nothing to do with the guest selection. That's interesting, I replied, still maintaining my calm tone, because the invitation was addressed in your handwriting, and the note was signed a friend. Since your husband clearly knew details about my service that aren't public knowledge, I'm wondering how long you've both been keeping track of my military career. The conversation around us had died completely now, and even the staff had stopped pretending to work as they listened to our exchange. Marcus was looking between his mother and me with growing horror, finally beginning to understand the depth of manipulation that had shaped his romantic decisions. Victoria had approached from the head table and was standing slightly behind Marcus, her face a mask of barely controlled fury at having her wedding reception turned into a forum for airing old grievances. Robert Henderson appeared at his wife's shoulder, his expression unreadable. Sarah, he said quietly, perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private. I think the other guests have heard enough family business for one evening. His suggestion was reasonable, but I could see Diana's panic increasing at the prospect of a private conversation where her husband might reveal even more uncomfortable truths. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Actually, I said, making a decision that surprised even me, I think I've heard everything I came here to learn. The note promised me truth about why my relationship with Marcus really ended, and your speech provided that clarity. I know now that it wasn't about my career or the uncertainty of military life. It was about fear, about choosing comfort over courage, about prioritizing social expectations over personal integrity. I turned to look directly at Marcus, who was still standing frozen between his mother and his new wife. You were never strong enough for the love I offered you, I said without malice. That's not a criticism, just a fact. I required someone who could handle uncertainty, who could find strength in supporting something bigger than themselves, who could love me enough to fight for us when things got difficult. You needed someone who would make your life easier, not more challenging. Victoria stepped forward then, her composure finally cracking. This is my wedding day, she said, her voice sharp with indignation and hurt. This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and you're ruining it with ancient history that doesn't matter anymore. Marcus chose me. He married me. Whatever happened between you two is over." I looked at Victoria with genuine sympathy. She was beautiful and perfectly suited to the world she'd been born into. But she was also about to discover that marrying someone who couldn't fight for their first love might not fight very hard for their second one either. "You're right," I said gently. "This is your wedding day, and I'm sorry my presence has caused you distress. That was never my intention." I picked up my small purse from the table and took one last look around the pavilion, at the faces of people who had spent the evening judging me without knowing anything about who I really was or what I'd accomplished. Some of them looked ashamed now. Others seemed merely uncomfortable at having witnessed such an emotionally charged confrontation. A few, mostly older men who might have been veterans themselves, nodded at me with unmistakable respect. "Before I go," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I want to thank Mr. Henderson for his honesty tonight, and for his gesture of respect. It means more than he knows." I paused, then added with quiet dignity, "And I want to wish Marcus and Victoria genuine happiness in their marriage. Everyone deserves to find love with someone who can appreciate who they are and what they offer." As I turned to leave, Robert Henderson called out, "Lieutenant Mitchell, wait." I stopped and looked back at him, curious about what else he might have to say. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package, walking over to hand it to me personally. "This belonged to my father," he said quietly. He was a Marine in the Pacific during World War II, and he always said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. "I think he would have wanted you to have it." The package was small and heavy, clearly containing something metal, but I didn't unwrap it in front of everyone. "Thank you," I said simply, holding his eyes for a moment longer. "This means more than you know." And it did. Not because I needed validation from the Henderson family, but because Robert's gesture represented a kind of moral courage that was rare in his social circle. He had risked his wife's anger and his guests' judgment to publicly acknowledge a truth that reflected poorly on his family's treatment of me. I walked out of that pavilion with my head high, not in triumph but in peace. The 3 years of wondering if I'd been too demanding, too difficult, too much to love had finally been answered. I hadn't been the problem. I'd been inconvenient for people who valued convenience over character, unsuitable for a family that prized conformity over courage. The drive home through the dark Napa Valley hills gave me time to process everything that had happened. I pulled over at a scenic overlook and finally opened Robert Henderson's gift. Inside was a Bronze Star medal, tarnished with age, along with a small card in his handwriting. "For Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, who exemplifies the courage my father taught me to recognize and honor. With respect and gratitude for your service." I sat in my car holding that medal and thinking about the 8-year-old girl named Amara, who was alive somewhere in Jordan because I had refused to leave her buried in rubble. I thought about the soldiers in my unit who had made it home safely because I had been trained to defuse the bombs meant to kill them. I thought about all the ways I had served my country and protected people who would never know my name or thank me for my sacrifice. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt genuinely proud of the choices I had made. Not because Robert Henderson had publicly acknowledged my worth, but because I finally understood that my worth had never been dependent on anyone else's recognition. I had lived with honor, served with distinction, and loved with complete authenticity. That was enough. That had always been enough. 2 weeks later, I received orders for a new assignment. The Army was starting a program to help transitioning veterans find meaningful employment, and they wanted me to lead the pilot program in Colorado. It was a chance to use my leadership experience to help other service members navigate the civilian world, to ensure that their sacrifices were valued and their skills were recognized. I accepted the assignment immediately, not because I was running away from painful memories, but because I was running toward a future where my experience and expertise could make a real difference. The Bronze Star ceremony would happen in Denver, surrounded by fellow veterans who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. It would be perfect. 6 months later, I stood in the crisp mountain air of Colorado Springs, watching a group of recently discharged veterans navigate their first civilian job interview workshop. The program I'd been asked to develop had grown beyond anyone's expectations, with participants traveling from 3 different states to attend our month-long transition seminars. What had started as a pilot program for 20 veterans had expanded to accommodate nearly 100 participants, each one carrying their own version of the story I knew so well. There was Maria Santos, a Navy mechanic who could repair any engine ever built, but had been told by 3 different employers that her military experience wasn't relevant to civilian automotive work. James Wright, a former Air Force logistics coordinator who had managed supply chains for entire bases, had been rejected from warehouse supervisor positions because he didn't have retail experience. Patricia Chen, an Army medic who had performed emergency surgery in field hospitals, was told she needed to go back to nursing school to be qualified for civilian medical positions. Each of their stories reminded me why this work mattered more than any recognition I'd received at fancy weddings or award ceremonies. These were people who had sacrificed years of their lives in service to their country, who had developed skills and leadership abilities under the most challenging circumstances imaginable, and who were being overlooked by employers who couldn't see past stereotypes about military rigidity and aggression. The job interview workshop was always the most challenging part of our program, not because the veterans lacked qualifications, but because they had to learn how to translate their military accomplishments into language that civilian employers could understand and value. I watched Maria struggle to explain how her experience maintaining helicopter engines in combat zones had prepared her for automotive repair work, her frustration evident as she tried to find words that would bridge the gap between military and civilian worlds. "Maria," I said, interrupting her practice interview with one of our volunteer HR professionals, "tell me about the most difficult repair you ever completed." Her face immediately brightened as she launched into a story about diagnosing and fixing a hydraulic failure on a transport helicopter while under enemy fire, working by flashlight in a sandstorm with limited tools and no backup parts. "Now," I continued when she finished, "translate that experience for someone who's never been in the military. What skills did you use that day that would make you valuable to a civilian employer?" I watched her process the question, her expression shifting as she began to understand how to reframe her military experience in terms that would resonate with civilian hiring managers. "I performed complex diagnostic work under extreme pressure," she said slowly, thinking through each word. "I demonstrated resourcefulness by creating solutions with limited resources. I showed leadership by keeping my team focused and calm during a crisis situation. I proved my technical expertise by successfully completing a critical repair that saved lives and millions of dollars in equipment." The transformation in her confidence was immediate and profound. This was the breakthrough moment that happened for every veteran in our program, the moment when they stopped seeing their military service as something they needed to overcome and started recognizing it as the incredible preparation it had been for civilian leadership roles. My own Bronze Star ceremony had taken place 3 weeks after I arrived in Colorado, in a small auditorium filled with active duty soldiers, veterans, and program participants. There were no fancy clothes or expensive wine, no social politics or hidden agendas. Just genuine respect from people who understood the weight of military service and the significance of the recognition I was receiving. General Patricia Morrison, who had flown in from the Pentagon specifically for the ceremony, spoke about the importance of the actions that had earned me the medal. She talked about courage under fire, about the split-second decisions that separate heroes from casualties, about the moral strength required to risk your own life for people you've never met. But what resonated most deeply was her closing statement about the responsibility that comes with surviving when others don't. "Lieutenant Mitchell's actions in Syria exemplify the best of military service," she had said, looking directly at me as she spoke. "But her work here in Colorado, helping other veterans transition to civilian success, exemplifies the best of military leadership. She is using her experience and expertise to ensure that no veteran is left behind, that no service member's contributions are overlooked or undervalued." Receiving the Bronze Star in that context, surrounded by people who truly understood its significance, felt completely different from any recognition I might have received in the Henderson family's social circles. This wasn't about impressing people who had never risked anything for anyone else. This was about being acknowledged by a community that shared my values and understood my sacrifices. The medal now sat in a place of honor in my small office, not as a trophy to be displayed for visitors, but as a daily reminder of why the work I was doing mattered. Every time I looked at it, I remembered 8-year-old Amara and the weight of her small body in my arms as I pulled her from the rubble. I remembered the responsibility I felt toward every soldier who had served under my command, and the obligation I had assumed to help them succeed in their post-military lives. 3 months after the ceremony, I received an unexpected phone call that forced me to confront the past I thought I'd left behind in Napa Valley. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Martinez, a reporter for Military Times magazine, and she was working on a story about veteran transition programs. She had heard about our success rates in Colorado and wanted to interview me about the innovative approaches we were using. The interview went well, focusing on the practical aspects of our program and the measurable outcomes we were achieving. 93% of our participants found meaningful employment within 6 months of completing the program, and their average starting salaries were 40% higher than veterans who tried to transition without specialized support. The statistics were impressive, but what made me proudest were the individual success stories, like Maria's promotion to head mechanic at a luxury car dealership, or James's new position as operations manager for a major distribution center. Near the end of our conversation, Rebecca asked a question that caught me off guard. "Lieutenant Mitchell, I've been researching your background for this article, and I came across some interesting information about your personal life. Specifically, about a wedding you attended in Napa Valley, where your former fiancé's father publicly acknowledged your military service. Would you be willing to comment on how that experience influenced your decision to focus on veteran advocacy?" I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to respond to a question I hadn't expected. The story of that wedding had apparently spread beyond the Henderson family's social circle, probably through guests who had been intrigued by the dramatic confrontation they'd witnessed. I wasn't surprised that someone had eventually connected my name to that evening, but I was surprised by how little emotional impact the memory had on me now. "That evening was certainly memorable," I said carefully, "but it wasn't what motivated me to pursue this work. My commitment to helping veterans transition successfully comes from my own experience navigating the civilian world after military service, and from witnessing too many qualified veterans struggle to find employment that matched their skills and experience." Rebecca pressed gently for more details, but I declined to elaborate on the personal aspects of that night. The Henderson family's drama wasn't relevant to the important work we were doing in Colorado, and I had no interest in rehashing old wounds for public consumption. The story that mattered was the one we were writing every day with our program participants, not the one that had ended in a Napa Valley wedding pavilion. After the interview was published, I received several messages through the program's website from people who had read the article and wanted to share their own stories. Most were from veterans thanking me for creating resources they wished had existed when they were transitioning, but one message stood out from the others. It was from Marcus Henderson, the first communication I'd received from him since his wedding day. The message was brief and carefully worded, clearly written and rewritten several times before being sent. He congratulated me on the success of the program and the recognition I was receiving for my work. He mentioned that he and Victoria were expecting their first child, and that he hoped I had found the happiness and fulfillment I deserved. But the most significant part of his message was a confession that he should have made years earlier. He acknowledged that his family's influence had played a role in our breakup, and that he should have been strong enough to fight for our relationship, instead of choosing the easier path his parents had laid out for him. He expressed genuine regret for the pain his weakness had caused, and respect for the strength I had shown in building a meaningful life despite the obstacles others had placed in my path. I read his message several times, looking for traces of the anger or hurt that his words might once have triggered. What I found instead was a kind of detached compassion for the man who had never learned to make difficult choices for himself. Marcus Henderson had gotten exactly what he'd wanted, a comfortable life with a suitable wife, surrounded by people who never challenged him to grow or change. I hoped that fatherhood might teach him some of the courage that romantic love hadn't been able to inspire. I never replied to his message, not out of spite or lingering resentment, but because there was nothing left to say between us. Our story had ended 3 years ago in his car outside the military base, and everything that had happened since then had simply been the natural consequences of choices we had both made. He had chosen comfort and social approval. I had chosen service and personal integrity. We were both living with the results of those decisions. As autumn settled over the Colorado mountains, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this place. The woman who had sat alone at table 8 in a Napa Valley wedding pavilion felt like someone I had known in another lifetime, someone who had still been seeking validation from people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered. The woman I had become was grounded in purpose and surrounded by a community of veterans who shared my values and understood my mission. Every morning, I woke up knowing that my work was making a real difference in people's lives. Every evening, I went to sleep satisfied that I had used my skills and experience in service of something larger than myself. The recognition and respect I received came from people whose opinions I valued, people who understood the true cost of military service and the real meaning of courage under fire. Standing in my office that evening, looking out at the snow-covered peaks of the Rocky Mountains, I realized that I had finally found what I had been searching for without knowing it. Not the approval of people who had never risked anything for anyone else, but the satisfaction of using my gifts in service of a cause that mattered. Not romantic love from someone who couldn't handle the reality of who I was, but professional respect from a community that valued strength and integrity above social conformity. The Bronze Star Medal caught the last rays of sunlight streaming through my window, its bronze surface gleaming with quiet dignity. It represented more than just one day of courage in a Syrian marketplace. It represented a lifetime of choices to serve others, to stand up for what was right, to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. And in that moment of perfect clarity, I understood that I had gotten exactly what I had always been looking for. I just hadn't recognized it until I stopped looking for it in all the wrong places. 2 years had passed since that autumn reflection in my Colorado office, and the Veteran Transition Program had grown into something I could never have imagined. What began as a pilot program for 20 participants had evolved into a national model, with satellite locations in 12 states and a waiting list of veterans eager to join our ranks. The Department of Veterans Affairs had officially endorsed our methodology, and we were receiving federal funding to expand our reach even further. I stood in the main auditorium of our new Denver headquarters, watching our latest graduating class of 67 veterans receive their completion certificates. Each face in the audience represented a success story that went far beyond simple job placement statistics. These were people who had rediscovered their sense of purpose, who had learned to articulate their value in civilian terms, who had found meaningful work that utilized their military training and leadership experience. Margaret Torres, the former Navy mechanic who had struggled in that first workshop 2 years ago, was now on our staff as a career transition specialist. She had parlayed her automotive expertise into a position as regional service manager for a major car manufacturer, and she spent her weekends volunteering with our program to help other veterans navigate similar career challenges. Her transformation from frustrated job seeker to confident professional mentor exemplified exactly what we were trying to achieve. James Wright had become something of a legend in our program circles. The former Air Force logistics coordinator who couldn't get hired for a warehouse supervisor position was now the chief operations officer for a Fortune 500 distribution company. More importantly, he had used his influence to create internship programs specifically designed for transitioning veterans, ensuring that other service members wouldn't face the same barriers he had encountered. Patricia Chen had returned to school, but not because employers told her she wasn't qualified for civilian medical work. She was completing her doctorate in emergency medicine, funded by a scholarship program she had established for veteran healthcare workers. Her military experience as a field medic had been the foundation for academic excellence that surprised no one who understood the complexity of battlefield medical care. Each of these success stories reinforced my belief that the problem had never been with our veterans' qualifications or capabilities. The problem had been with a civilian employment system that didn't know how to recognize and value military experience. Our program didn't just help veterans find jobs. It educated employers about the incredible resource they were overlooking when they dismissed military candidates. The ceremony concluded with remarks from General Patricia Morrison, who had become a regular supporter of our work and a powerful advocate for veteran employment initiatives. She spoke about the economic impact of underemployed veterans, the security implications of failing to integrate military experience into civilian leadership roles, and the moral obligation society had to honor military service through meaningful post-service opportunities. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, she said, using my recent promotion in rank, has created something unprecedented in veteran services. This isn't charity work or feel-good programming. This is strategic human resource development that benefits both veterans and the employers who hire them. The success rates speak for themselves, but more importantly, the transformation in confidence and purpose I see in these graduates represents the very best of military values applied to civilian challenges. After the ceremony, I was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the Dean of Business at Denver University, who had been observing our program for several months as part of a research study on veteran employment outcomes. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of academic leadership, and she had requested a private meeting to discuss what she called an unusual opportunity. We walked to my office, which had evolved from a small space with a single Bronze Star medal into a comprehensive command center filled with program materials, success story documentation, and commendations from various military and civilian organizations. The walls were covered with photos of program graduates at their new jobs, thank you letters from employers who had discovered the value of hiring veterans, and certificates of appreciation from organizations that had partnered with our initiatives. Dr. Hartman studied the displays with obvious interest before settling into the chair across from my desk. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, she began, I've been documenting your program's methodology and outcomes for the past 18 months. And I'm convinced that you've developed something that could revolutionize how we approach career transition services. Not just for veterans, but for any population facing employment challenges. She explained that the university was in the process of establishing a new school of leadership and public service, designed to bridge the gap between academic theory and real-world application. They were looking for someone to serve as the founding director, someone with practical leadership experience, proven program development skills, and the vision to create something entirely new in higher education. We're not talking about a traditional academic appointment, she clarified. This would be an opportunity to build an institution from the ground up, to develop curriculum that prepares students for meaningful public service careers, while also serving as a resource for organizations that need leadership development support. Your work with veterans has demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking and practical impact we're looking for. The offer was both flattering and intriguing, but it also represented a significant departure from the direct service work that had become my passion. I would be trading daily contact with individual veterans for the longer-term impact of institutional change and academic influence. It was the kind of opportunity that could amplify my work exponentially, but it would also require leaving behind the hands-on mentoring relationships that gave my current role its deepest satisfaction. Dr. Hartman seemed to understand my hesitation. I know this represents a major career shift, she said, but consider the multiplier effect. Right now, you're directly impacting hundreds of veterans each year. As a dean, you could train thousands of students who would carry these principles into their own careers, creating a ripple effect that could influence employment practices across entire industries. She left me with a formal offer letter and a timeline for decision-making, but she also left me with a fundamental question about the direction of my career and the scope of my impact. Was I ready to move from operational leadership to strategic influence? Could I maintain my connection to the veteran community while expanding into broader educational and policy work? That evening, I drove up into the mountains to a hiking trail that had become my favorite place for serious thinking. The physical challenge of the climb and the clarity of the mountain air helped me process complex decisions, and this was certainly one of the most complex I'd faced since leaving the military. The trail was steep but familiar, and I found myself settling into the rhythm of steady movement that had always helped organize my thoughts. As I climbed higher, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this crossroads. 5 years ago, I had been sitting in a wedding pavilion feeling like an outsider in civilian society, questioning whether my military service had any value beyond the war zone. Now I was being asked to lead an academic institution that would shape the next generation of public service leaders. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe. The summit offered a panoramic view of the Colorado Plains stretching endlessly eastward, broken by the lights of Denver and smaller communities scattered across the landscape. Each point of light represented families and businesses and organizations that could benefit from the kind of leadership training I had been developing with veterans. The scope of potential impact was both exciting and overwhelming. I thought about Robert Henderson's salute that night in Napa Valley, and how his public acknowledgement had marked the beginning of my understanding that military experience was something to be proud of, rather than something to overcome. I thought about General Morrison's recognition of my work, and the validation that had come from the military community I respected most. I thought about Maria and James and Patricia, and all the other veterans who had found new purpose through our program. But mostly, I thought about Amara, the 8-year-old girl I had pulled from the rubble in Syria. She would be 10 now, probably attending school in Jordan, learning and growing and building a future that was possible because someone had been willing to dig through concrete and debris to reach her. Every veteran I had helped find meaningful employment was like pulling someone else from different kind of rubble, the debris of misunderstanding and missed opportunities that buried so much military talent in civilian indifference. The academic opportunity Dr. Hartman was offering would allow me to pull more people from that rubble, to train others to recognize and develop leadership potential wherever they found it. It would mean leaving direct service work for indirect influence, trading immediate impact for systemic change. Both approaches had value, but only one felt aligned with the person I had become and the leader I wanted to be. I made my decision on that mountaintop, as the sun set behind the peaks and the lights of the city grew brighter in the gathering darkness. I would accept the academic position, but with conditions that would allow me to maintain my connection to veteran services and ensure that military leadership principles remained central to whatever I built at the university. 6 months later, I stood in the empty office that would become my dean's suite, looking out at a campus quad where students were beginning their spring semester journeys. The School of Leadership and Public Service was still under construction, both physically and programmatically, but we already had our first cohort of 30 graduate students enrolled in pilot programs that combined academic rigor with practical leadership application. The curriculum we were developing drew heavily from military leadership principles but applied them to civilian challenges in nonprofit management, government service, corporate social responsibility, and community development. Our students included veterans transitioning to civilian careers, corporate executives seeking to develop more authentic leadership skills, and recent graduates who wanted to combine career success with social impact. Maria Torres had joined our staff as Director of Veterans Services, bringing her automotive expertise and program development experience to create specialized tracks for veterans interested in technical leadership roles. James Wright served on our advisory board, helping us understand corporate perspectives on leadership development and veteran employment. Patricia Chen was one of our first doctoral candidates, researching the intersection of military medical training and civilian healthcare leadership. The Bronze Star Medal that had once sat alone on my office shelf was now part of a larger display that included academic awards, program recognitions, and photos from graduation ceremonies. But the medal remained in the center, a daily reminder of the courage and sacrifice that had shaped my understanding of what leadership really meant. 3 years after opening, our school had become a nationally recognized center for leadership education, with graduates serving in influential positions across government, business, and nonprofit sectors. Our veteran transition program had been integrated into the curriculum as a practicum opportunity, allowing students to gain hands-on experience while providing continued services to military families. I received occasional updates about the Henderson family through mutual acquaintances in the Bay Area. Marcus and Victoria had divorced after 2 years of marriage, apparently unable to overcome the fundamental incompatibilities that had been obvious to everyone except themselves. Diana Henderson had retired from her social leadership roles after a scandal involving misappropriated charity funds, though she had avoided criminal charges. Robert Henderson had quietly established a scholarship fund for military veterans, administered through our school, though he had insisted that his name not be associated with the program. These updates felt like news from another lifetime, interesting but irrelevant to the person I had become and the work I was doing. The painful chapter of my romantic relationship with Marcus had evolved into something much more valuable. A clear understanding of my own worth and a commitment to building a life aligned with my deepest values. On a recent spring evening, as I walked across campus after a particularly productive faculty meeting, I encountered a young woman in army dress blues heading toward the library. She was clearly a student, probably working on an assignment, but something about her bearing reminded me of my younger self struggling to find my place in civilian academic environments. I approached her and introduced myself, learning that she was Captain Jennifer Walsh, a recent Iraq veteran enrolled in our public administration graduate program. She was working on a thesis about veteran reintegration policies, and she seemed both surprised and pleased to meet someone who understood her background and respected her experience. "Ma'am," she said as our conversation concluded, "I just wanted to thank you for creating this program. It's the first time since leaving the military that I've felt like my service experience was seen as an asset rather than an obstacle." Her words carried the weight of recognition and gratitude that made every challenge of building the school worthwhile. As I watched her walk toward the library, I thought about all the Captain Walshes who were finding their paths through our programs, and all the future leaders who would benefit from their service and expertise. The ripple effects Dr. Hartman had described were becoming visible in measurable ways, but more importantly, they were becoming visible in the confidence and purpose of individual students who were learning to value their own experiences and capabilities. The mountain peaks were silhouetted against the evening sky as I made my way home, their permanent presence a reminder of the stability and clarity I had found in Colorado. This place had become more than a geographic location. It had become the foundation for a life built on service, integrity, and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work. The woman who had once questioned her worth in a Napa Valley wedding pavilion had evolved into someone who created spaces where others could discover their own value and potential. The journey had been longer and more complex than I could have imagined, but every challenge had contributed to the strength and wisdom I now brought to leadership roles. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to serve others in their pursuit of meaningful careers and authentic leadership. Tonight I was content to reflect on how far I had traveled from that moment of public humiliation to this place of quiet confidence and institutional influence. The story that had begun with a mysterious wedding invitation had become something much larger and more important, a testament to the power of resilience, the value of authentic service, and the possibility of transformation that exists when we choose courage over comfort, purpose over popularity, and service over self-interest. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.